It was a daunting task, nearly impossible in some places. The United States government, having defeated the rebellious Confederacy after 4 years of horrendous civil war, was faced with having to enforce the peace across those states. They did it through military occupation. But there was also the job of making the great outcome of the war, the end of slavery across the nation, into a reality. That job was given to a new government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, beginning in June 1865. Made up largely of blue-coated Army personnel, the Bureau issued rations and clothing to thousands of people who had spent their entire lives as someone else's property, with no freedom to make decisions of their own. They also supervised labor contracts to see that those people were properly paid for their work. After learning of emancipation at the end of the war in Texas, thousands of formerly enslaved people wanted to remain at the only homes they had known, but with wages and free will. Thousands more moved on, seeking a free life wherever that might be. For some, it was in cities, but most wanted a rural life, using the agriculture they knew in bondage to farm their own ground for the first time in their lives. Since many of the newly freed had never been provided with the skills to navigate life on their own, their new settlements became shared obligations, communities in the truest sense. Many of those defeated in the war, however, were not ready to give up the old social order. The Bureau and the U.S. Army soldiers were supposed to settle those disputes. Freedmen's Bureau records show crime perpetrated by both the freedmen and the whites, but the vast majority of the violence documented was by former Confederates attacking people they recently thought of as property. In parts of Texas, life remained brutal. Colonel Edwin Gregory, who was second in command of the Bureau in the state, said slavery virtually exists the same as though the old system of oppression was still in force. Some slaveholders refused to let the people they held leave at all. Reports were common of enslaved men and women being kept in chains or makeshift jails by their former owners. In extreme cases, the enslavers killed people rather than set them free. When the Freedmen's Bureau enforced the new laws of the land, most Southerners railed against it as harassment. In several places, things turned very ugly between locals and occupying soldiers. The other main task for the Freedmen's Bureau was setting up schools for the newly freed African Americans, often partnering with benevolent societies from the North. Though Texas, unlike some other southern states, never made it illegal for blacks to learn reading and writing, pre-Civil War education for people of color was almost non-existent. Well over 95% of the newly freed people were illiterate. As with everything else the Bureau did, there was vocal opposition from the unreconstructed rebels. Some of the new school buildings were burned to the ground during the night. But most of the Bureau's schools were filled to capacity and then some. Classrooms bulged with 150 or more children, sometimes sitting two to a chair. In the evenings, their parents and grandparents learned to read. From the start, the Bureau was at a disadvantage with a huge geographic area to administer and very limited resources with which to do it. The biggest problem was the constant hostility they faced from the former Confederates. All operations in Texas came to an end in July 1870, before the Freedmen's Bureau completed its entire mission in the state.